The morning Nora Calloway learned she had inherited the smokehouse began the way all of her mornings had begun for the past 3 years, with the sound of a radiator knocking against a thin wall and the smell of something that was almost coffee, but wasn't quite. She lay still for a long moment on the narrow mattress she'd wedged into the corner of her apartment's only bedroom, listening to the knocking, counting the beats between each hollow clang the way a person counts, beats between thunder and lightning to measure how far the storm has traveled. She had learned to measure things carefully. Distance, time, the space between what she had and what she needed. The ceiling above her was water-stained in the shape of something she'd never been able to identify. She'd stared at it enough mornings to have tried and failed 100 times. Some nights, it looked like a dog. Most mornings, it looked like nothing at all. Just a bruise left by someone else's carelessness on a structure that had stopped being maintained long before she arrived. She sat up slowly, the way people sit up when the act of rising is a negotiation rather than a reflex. Her back spoke first, as it always did, that low, grinding complaint that had started after her second year of double shifts at the laundry service. It reminded her of her age, which was 41, and of the years that had formed that age, which had not been gentle. The room was small enough that she could see everything from where she sat. The dresser with the broken mirror. She'd propped the broken half against the good half, so you got a fragmented version of yourself when you looked into it, like a face seen through cracked ice. Not the stack of bills on the corner of the dresser, held down by a smooth river stone her daughter Lily had brought home from a school trip. The river stone was the only pretty thing in the room, and Nora had let it stay precisely because of that. She stood, pulled her cardigan tighter, and opened the bedroom door as quietly as she could. Lily was still sleeping in the main room, curled on the pull-out sofa that they'd converted into a permanent bed because the apartment technically had one bedroom, and Nora had insisted that Lily have it until Nora eventually, quietly, without making it a conversation, traded places with her daughter. Lily was 8 years old, with her father's dark hair and Nora's stubborn jawline, and she slept with her arms wrapped around a stuffed horse named Captain, which had been a gift from a school friend, and which Lily treated with the seriousness of a sacred object. Nora stood in the doorway of the main room for a moment, watching her daughter breathe. The morning light was coming in sideways through the blinds, laying thin orange lines across the floor like something trying to send a message. Outside, the town of Millhaven, Virginia, was waking up in its slow and unremarkable way. A truck engine turning over somewhere on the next block, a dog barking twice and then going silent, a radio from the neighbor's apartment coming through the wall like a conversation overheard from a great distance. She moved to the kitchen and turned the burner on under the kettle. The stove was gas, so it meant it took 2 attempts to light, because the igniter had been broken for the better part of a year, and she'd been meaning to say something to the landlord about it, but had not, partly because the landlord was already looking for reasons to raise the rent, and partly because Nora had developed, over the years, a deep reluctance to ask anyone for anything. She lit the burner with a match from the box she kept in the drawer next to the stove. The flame caught, turned blue, steadied. She had $47 and some coins until the end of the week. She'd done the math the night before while Lily slept, which was the only time she did math of that kind, because doing it while Lily was awake would have required a certain expression on her face that Lily was too perceptive not to notice. $47. Rent was past due by 9 days. The laundry service had cut her hours again after Thanksgiving, the way they always did when the holiday surge ended, and the manager started looking at the schedule with a sharp eye and a quiet ruthlessness. She had applied for a second job at a grocery distribution center in the next county and had not heard back. She had applied for 3 jobs before that and had heard back from none of them. She was not, by nature, a person given to despair. There was a core in her, something dense and almost mineral in its composition, that had always resisted the full collapse that her circumstances might have justified. But on mornings like this one, in the kitchen that smelled faintly of damp and old cooking oil, with the kettle beginning its slow ascent toward a boil and Lily still sleeping on the pull-out sofa with Captain tucked under her arm, Nora felt the weight of things with a clarity that was almost physical, like pressure, like the sensation of being underwater. The kettle murmured. She spooned coffee into the filter. The morning light shifted, and the orange lines on the floor moved fractionally, and outside a second dog joined the first, and then both went quiet again. She did not know, standing there in the kitchen of her apartment in Millhaven, Virginia, pouring hot water through a paper filter, that this was the last ordinary morning of her life. She did not know that by nightfall she would be sitting in the back of the room at Kessler and Pratt, the law firm on Broad Street, watching her brother smile the particular smile of men who have already won something they didn't have to fight for. She did not know that within 72 hours she would be standing in front of a small, half-collapsed brick structure at the far edge of her father's land, with the November wind cutting through her coat and a key the size of her thumb that opened a padlock the color of rust. She did not know any of that. She just poured the water and waited. Harold Calloway had died on a Tuesday in mid-November, which was the kind of week in the Shenandoah Valley when the last of the leaves had come down and the mountains had gone the color of pewter, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold earth and the particular loneliness that settles over rural Virginia when summer's permission has finally run out. He had died in his sleep, which the hospice nurse said was a mercy, and which Nora supposed was true in the way that most mercies are. True, but not entirely sufficient. She had not spoken to her father in 9 years. The estrangement had begun the way most of the serious ruptures in her life had begun, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each one adding a degree or two of temperature to a situation that eventually reached its boiling point and scalded everyone standing nearby. The breaking point had been her marriage to Colin Hutchins, which her father had opposed from the beginning with a quiet, persistent ferocity that he never entirely explained, but that Nora had always suspected had something to do with the fact that Colin was from Roanoke rather than the Valley, which in her father's cosmology was practically a foreign country. The marriage had lasted 6 years and had produced Lily and a mutual understanding that both parties were fundamentally incompatible in ways that had been invisible at 29, but were impossible to ignore at 35. The divorce was quiet and uncharged, the way the endings of things sometimes are when both people are simply relieved to stop pretending. Afterward, Nora had tried twice to reconnect with her father. The first attempt had been a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and ended with Harold saying he needed to check on the cattle and not calling back. The second had been a letter, 2 pages, which she had spent an entire weekend writing and rewriting. She never received a reply, though she had found out later, through the complicated telegraph system of family gossip, that he had read it, that he had kept it, that it had been found on his nightstand when he died. She had learned of his death from Dale, her oldest brother, who had called on a Tuesday evening and said, in a voice that carefully excluded any particular emotional weight, "Dad passed this morning. The service is Friday." He had then given her the address of the funeral home and hung up before she could say anything in response. She had driven the 2 hours to Waynesboro with Lily in the back seat, and Captain in Lily's arms. The service was small. Harold Calloway had not been a man with a large social circumference, and it was held in a church he had attended on and off for 50 years, with the kind of commitment that was more about habit than conviction. Nora sat in the third row with Lily beside her, and she watched the back of Dale's head in the first row, and beside him, Brent, her younger brother, and beside Brent, his wife, Sandra, who had always regarded Nora with the precise and calibrated civility of someone who does not wish to appear rude, but does not wish to appear warm either. She had not cried at the service. She wasn't sure what that meant. The reading of the will happened 9 days after the funeral in the offices of Kessler and Pratt, in a conference room that smelled of old paper and the particular institutional staleness of a room where difficult conversations happen on a regular basis. The conference room had a long oval table of dark wood and chairs that were more formal than comfortable, and a window that looked out over a small parking lot, and beyond that, a gas station with a hand-painted sign that read, "Lotto tickets sold here," in letters that had begun to peel at the edges. There were 4 people in the room besides the attorney, whose name was Gerald Pratt, and who had the slightly compressed manner of a man who has delivered a great deal of difficult news and has learned to do so with a minimum of editorial involvement. Dale was there, 63 years old, with the broad shoulders and salt and pepper hair of a man who has spent his life doing outdoor work, and the particular settled authority of a firstborn son who has never seriously questioned his own position in the family hierarchy. Brent was there beside him, 58, thinner than Dale, with a nervous energy that expressed itself in the constant small movement of his fingers against the table surface. Sandra had stayed in the waiting room, which was not particularly remarkable, since the will had been understood to involve only the Calloway children. And there was Nora, when she sat across the table from her brothers, with her hands folded in her lap and her coat still on, because the room was cold in a way that seemed to have nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the particular configuration of the people in it. Gerald Pratt put on his reading glasses, opened the folder in front of him, and began. The farm was 422 acres of Shenandoah Valley land that Harold Calloway had inherited from his own father and had spent 60 years tending, arguing with, and occasionally hating the way people sometimes hate the things they are most committed to. It included the main farmhouse, a white clapboard structure built in 1911 and expanded twice since, 4 outbuildings in various states of repair, the pastureland and its fencing, 2 tractor sheds, a hay barn, and somewhere toward the back of the property, beyond the tree line, and at the edge of a shallow depression in the land, a smokehouse. Old brick, built sometime in the 1930s. Not on any of the official property surveys, but present nonetheless, standing, as it had stood for decades, in the particular way of structures that have outlasted their original purpose and continue to exist purely through the stubbornness of their construction. Harold Calloway had divided his estate with a methodical attention to fairness that was, Nora would later think, deeply characteristic of a man who believed that fairness and equity were the same thing, which they are not, but which most people spend their lives failing to distinguish between. Dale received the farmhouse, the primary pastureland, and the hay barn. This represented, and by Gerald Pratt's estimate, approximately 60% of the estate's assessed value, which was justified, according to a clause in the will that Gerald Pratt read in the same careful monotone he used for everything, by the fact that Dale had lived on and worked the farm for the past 21 years and had contributed substantially to its upkeep and improvement. Brent received the secondary pasture land, the tractor sheds and their equipment, and the breeding herd, which had been appraised at a figure that made Brent's fingers stop their nervous movement on the table, and rest, briefly, in a posture that Nora recognized as relief. For Nora, Harold Calloway had left the following: the smokehouse structure and its immediately surrounding parcel of land, comprising approximately 1/3 of an acre, to accessible via the Eastern Service Road. There was no additional bequest, no cash, no personal effects specifically designated. Only the note, which Gerald Pratt read last, in a slightly quieter voice, as though he understood that it was a different kind of document from the rest. Nora, I kept your letter. I have read it many times. I am sorry for the years we lost. I could not find the words while I was living. I hope you can forgive an old man who was better with land than he was with people. The smokehouse was your grandfather's. He built it himself. There is more to that structure than meets the eye. I leave that to you to discover. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car pulled into the gas station parking lot. The lotto sign shifted slightly in the wind. Then Dale cleared his throat, and Brent's fingers started moving again, and Dale said, in a voice that was careful enough to be almost kind, "Well, Nora, I guess you got yourself a smokehouse." He said it without malice, she thought, or at least without obvious malice. He said it the way you might note that someone has been given a piece of furniture that doesn't quite go with anything they own. An acknowledgement of the situation that declines to engage with its implications. And Brent almost smiled, but caught himself, though not quite quickly enough, and Sandra, in the waiting room, would be told about it later, and would make the particular sound she made when she found something confirming of an opinion she had held for a long time. Nora nodded once and looked out the window at the gas station and the peeling letters of the lotto sign, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said for her, and because the one thing she had carried out of her childhood in this valley entirely intact was the knowledge of when silence was more useful than speech. She drove back to Millhaven with Lily asleep in the back seat, and Captain fallen sideways against the door, and the dark coming in over the mountains in a long purple wave from the west. And she drove the whole way without the radio on, just the sound of the tires on the pavement and the heater running, and somewhere beneath all of that, the faint, barely audible hum of something she could not yet identify, could not yet name, but which had started up in the back of her mind in the moment Gerald Pratt read her grandfather's name in connection with the smokehouse, and which refused, or despite the dark and the silence and the weight of the drive, to quiet itself entirely. Millhaven was not a place that held her. She had moved there when the divorce was finalized, because it was the cheapest rental she could find, within reasonable driving distance of Lily's school and of the laundry service. And in the 3 years since, she had accumulated nothing in that apartment that couldn't be loaded into her car in under an hour. This was not a philosophical choice. It was the natural result of living on a margin so narrow that accumulation was effectively impossible. Anything bought had to replace something already worn out, and sentiment was a luxury that required a surplus she did not have. But sometimes, on the nights when Lily was asleep and the apartment was as quiet as it ever got, and the Riverstone sat on the dresser next to the stack of bills like a small ambassador from a world in which things had weight and permanence and were chosen rather than inherited by circumstance. On those nights, Nora thought about the valley. She thought about the smell of it, which was specific to that particular hollow between the mountains in a way she had never encountered anywhere else. A combination of wood smoke and creek water, and the particular mineral quality of the soil that she had grown up with, and which she had never been able to entirely stop reaching for in other places and failing to find. She thought about the sound of the mornings there, which were different from the mornings anywhere else she had lived. Not quieter, exactly, but more layered, more patient, as though the valley understood something about time that other places had not yet figured out. She did not let herself think about these things very often. Sentimentality was expensive in ways that were harder to measure than rent, but just as real. The morning after the reading of the will, she woke before Lily and sat in the kitchen with her almost coffee and the Riverstone and Gerald Pratt's business card, on the back of which he had written, in a neat, small hand, the address of the Eastern Service Road and the information that a key had been left for her with the Waynesboro branch of First Valley Bank, where Harold Calloway had maintained his accounts, and where the key was being held in an envelope, along with the deed to the Smokehouse parcel. She turned the business card over a few times, for reading her grandfather's words in her memory. There is more to that structure than meets the eye, and wondering what an old man, working with the reduced vocabulary of a will, had meant by that. Whether it was simply the kind of thing you say to soften the blow of an inadequate inheritance, a gesture toward meaning in something that had none. Whether it was a specific instruction that she was meant to follow. Whether her father, who had been better with land than with people, had known something about the smokehouse that he had been unable to communicate in any more direct way. She picked up the Riverstone and held it for a moment, feeling its smooth weight in her palm. And then she set it down and looked at the bill on the top of the stack, which was for the electric service and which had a red past due notice printed across the top in letters the color of dried blood. Then she picked up her phone and called her manager at the laundry service and told him she needed 4 days off. He said he wasn't sure he could hold her position for 4 days. She said she understood, which she did, and she said she would be back on Friday, which she would be, and she hung up before either of them could make the conversation into something larger than it needed to be. Then she woke Lily and made oatmeal, the only breakfast she had the ingredients for, and told her daughter that they were going to Waynesboro for a few days, which Lily received with the complicated equanimity of a child who has learned that plans are a provisional arrangement with circumstances and not a guarantee. Then they drove out of Millhaven at 7 in the morning with a bag of clothes each, and Captain wrapped in Lily's arms in the passenger seat, because at 8 years old, Lily was still young enough to travel in the front when the back seat was empty, and Nora was still young enough to allow it. The mountains were visible to the west before they'd been driving 20 minutes, dark shapes against a sky that hadn't decided its color yet, and Nora felt the pull of them the way she always had, the way you feel the pull of something you have spent years trying not to need. The key at First Valley Bank was heavier than she expected. It was an old skeleton key, the kind that belongs to a different era of locks, black iron worn smooth on the barrel from decades of handling, and still faintly greasy at the bow in the way of objects that have been used often and by hands that never quite came clean. The banker who gave it to her was a young woman with a professional manner and an expression that suggested she had been told something about the context of the key's bequest, but had decided, correctly, that it was not her business to convey opinions about it. Along with the key came the deed, 4 pages of legal description that established the bounds of the 1/3 acre parcel in terms of meets and distances from survey markers that had last been recorded in 1967, and with it a single piece of paper, folded twice, that bore her father's handwriting. The handwriting was shaky in the way of old hands, and the letters were formed with the care of someone for whom writing had always required deliberate effort, but the words were clear enough. The combination for the inner lock is 4, 14, 37. Your grandfather used his birthday. He was not a man who trusted complicated things. Be patient with the Smokehouse. It rewards patience. She read the note 3 times in the parking lot of the bank, while Lily sat in the car with Captain and looked out the window at a flock of starlings moving over the building across the street in that compressed, wheeling pattern that starlings make, like a single mind distributed through 100 bodies. Then she folded the note carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest, where she kept things she did not want to lose. She had made arrangements for Lily to stay with a woman named June Purdy, who had been her mother's best friend, and was now in her late 70s, and lived on the edge of Waynesboro, in a house that smelled of pine cleaner and cinnamon rolls, and which Lily had been to twice before, and regarded with the cautious approval of a child who has learned not to attach too quickly to pleasant places. June had offered without being asked, which was the kind of person June was, and she had said Lily could stay as long as Nora needed, which was the kind of generosity that Nora had learned to accept without spending too much time examining it, because examining it tended to make her feel things she didn't have time to feel. She drove to the farm in the late afternoon, alone, saw through the particular amber light of a November afternoon in the Shenandoah Valley that falls at a low angle and makes everything it touches look temporarily significant. The service road that ran along the eastern edge of her father's land was unpaved. 2 wheel tracks in dried mud with a strip of dead grass running down the center, and it took her car down along a hedgerow of cedar trees and then out into an open section of pasture before curving back toward the tree line. She followed it until the tree line thickened, and then the road ended, not at a gate or a marker, but simply at a place where it was clear no vehicle had gone further in a long time. She got out of the car and stood in the cold and looked. The Smokehouse was approximately 40 yards from where she'd parked, at the edge of a shallow depression in the land that might once have been a pond or a cistern, and was now just a low place where the grass grew longer and darker than the surrounding pasture. The structure was made of brick, old brick, the kind fired in the era when brick colors were determined by the particular clay of whatever county you were in, and so varied from place to place. These bricks, a deep, uneven red, with occasional streaks of orange and brown that made them look like the flanks of an animal. It was roughly the size of a large garden shed, maybe 12 feet by 14, with walls that stood perhaps 8 feet at their highest point before they angled inward toward a low-pitched roof of old tin, many of the panels rusted through, and one section collapsed entirely on the northeast corner, where something, age, weather, and the sheer patient pressure of time, had finally succeeded in pulling it down. The chimney that rose from the center of the roof had lost its cap. Dead vines wrapped the south wall entirely and had begun working their way across the tin roof in a network of grasping tendrils that would eventually, if unaddressed, accomplish what the weather had not yet quite finished. She stood at the edge of the depression and looked at it for a long time without moving. The wind came across the open pasture and moved the dead grass around her feet and lifted one edge of her scarf and then dropped it again. Somewhere behind her, in the direction of the main house, a crow called once and then went quiet. Her brothers had taken the farmhouse, the cattle, the equipment, the fencing, the barns. They had taken, between them, everything that a lifetime of farming could be said to have produced, all the visible, appraisable, bankable evidence of Harold Calloway's decades of labor on this valley land. And for Nora, they had left this, a crumbling brick box at the edge of a dead pond, wrapped in vines, with a rusted tin roof and a chimney that the wind moved through with the low, plaintive moan of something that had given up, trying to serve its original purpose. She thought about how they had looked at her in that conference room. Dale, with his carefully neutral acknowledgement. Brent, with the almost smile. She thought about Brent's wife, Sandra, and the particular sound she would make when she heard. So she thought about the other families in Millhaven who would find out somehow, because things always got out. And she thought about the conversation at the laundry service, the sympathetic looks, the kind of pity that is indistinguishable from satisfaction. She stood there in the cold, and she let herself feel all of that, let it come through her fully, the humiliation and the grief for a father she had lost twice, once 9 years ago and once this November, and the cold, practical weight of the situation, the $47, the past-due electric bill, the laundry service, and its fragile offer to hold her position until Friday. She let it all come because she had learned that it was better to let things come through you than to try to hold them back, that the trying always cost more than the feeling. And then, when it had passed, not gone, but through, she took the key from her pocket and walked down into the depression and across the dead grass to the smokehouse door. The door was a heavy thing, double-planked hardwood, with iron hinges that had oxidized to a deep brown and fitted with a padlock of the old style, thick shackle and a wide keyhole that accepted the skeleton key with a solidity that surprised her. The mechanism had ceased from disuse, and she had to work it, applying pressure, releasing slightly, rotating the key with steady force rather than brute effort, before the lock finally surrendered, with a sound like a cleared throat, deep and reluctant, and then done. She pushed the door inward. The smell came first. It always does, in old structures, and it is always a language, a compressed history expressed in odor rather than words. The smokehouse smelled of decades of cured meat, a deep, embedded smell that had soaked into the brick itself so thoroughly that it was no longer a smell of any specific thing, but simply of that smokiness, that char and salt, and the particular sweetness of hardwood that had been burning on and off for decades in a confined space. Beneath that, the smell of cold earth. The floor was packed dirt, dark with old grease and moisture, and it breathed the particular cold, damp breath of undisturbed ground. And beneath that, something else. Something she could not immediately identify. A mineral quality, clean in a way that seemed out of place in a structure this age and condition. Like cold stone. Like a well. She stepped inside. The interior was a single room, low-ceilinged. The rafters still hung with rusted iron hooks in rows, 8 of them across, she counted automatically, from which meat had once hung in the smoke of the central fire pit. The fire pit was a low brick rectangle in the center of the dirt floor, long cold, filled at its center with a cone of old ash that had never been disturbed. The light came through the open door behind her and through 2 small slits in the south wall. Not windows, exactly, but deliberate openings left in the brickwork for ventilation, each no wider than her hand. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, the way you turn in a new space when you are trying to understand it. The east wall, the west wall, the south wall with its ventilation slits and its thick coating of vine shadow against the outside, and the north wall. She stopped. The north wall was different. It took her a moment to understand why. The other 3 walls were built with the same brick, that deep, uneven red she had noted from outside, laid in a running bond pattern with mortar that had crumbled in places to a pale powder, but was still, for the most part, intact and visible. The mortar was old in the way that old mortar is old, with a texture between the bricks that has settled and compressed over decades into something that is almost geological. The mortar and the brick become a single material, bonded by time into something that is harder to separate than its components alone would suggest. The north wall was brick. The pattern was the same running bond. The color was close, that same deep red, that same variation of orange and brown. But the mortar was wrong. She took a step closer, then another. She crouched in front of the wall, her hands on her knees, and looked at the mortar lines at eye level. In the other 3 walls, the mortar was the color of ash, pale gray, almost white in the slits of light coming through the ventilation openings. It had the slightly rough texture of material that has been mixed and applied with skill, but not with modern tooling. The surface slightly uneven, slightly irregular. In the north wall, the mortar was slightly darker. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious from a distance or in poor light. But here, crouched in front of it with the thin November light coming through the door, she could see it. The mortar in the north wall was a shade or 2 deeper, and its texture was different. Smoother, more compressed, as though it had been applied with more precision and had been mixed to a slightly different ratio. She reached out and pressed her fingertip against the mortar of the east wall, then against the mortar of the north wall. The east wall yielded slightly under pressure. Old mortar, calcified, but still containing some trace of gyve. The north wall was harder, firmer, more dense, different mortar. Laid later. She stood up slowly. She looked at the north wall, from floor to ceiling, approximately 12 feet wide, the full width of the interior. Brick, running bond, iron hooks in the rafters above it, the same as the others. She reached up and tapped the north wall with her knuckle, a sound like a knock on a door. Then she turned and tapped the east wall. The east wall returned a flat, solid sound. The sound of brick backed by more brick, then the sound of mass. The north wall returned something different, not dramatically different, not hollow exactly. But there was a slight change in resonance, a very small, very subtle shift in the quality of the sound, as though the wall were doing something other than simply containing its own thickness. She tapped it again in 3 places, high, middle, low. The difference was more pronounced at the middle section, a zone perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, roughly centered in the wall at about chest height. In that zone, the tap returned something that was just barely, a fraction of a degree, less solid. She stood back. Her breath was visible in the cold air of the smokehouse, small clouds appearing and dissolving in the dimness with each exhalation. Behind her, through the open door, the afternoon light had shifted. The crow called again from the direction of the farmhouse, and this time it was answered by another, and the 2 of them exchanged something brief and conclusory before going quiet. Nora looked at the north wall for a long time. She looked at the mortar, at the brick, at the slight variation in color that anyone could have explained in a dozen ways. Different batches of material, different weather conditions during construction, the variation that is inherent in any handmade thing. She looked at the zone in the center, where the tap returned that almost hollow quality, that barely perceptible shift in resonance that could have been nothing, could have been the echo of an imperfection in the brickwork, could have been the result of a layer of old smoke resin on the interior surface. It could have been her imagination reaching for meaning in a situation that offered very little else to reach for. She thought about her grandfather, who had built this structure himself in the 1930s, in a decade when a man with hands and bricks and time could decide to enclose a space and then enclose it without telling anyone why. She thought about her father's note. There is more to that structure than meets the eye. Be patient with the smokehouse. It rewards patience. She thought about the combination her father had written down. 4, 14, 37. Her grandfather's birthday. An inner lock her father had written. She looked at the north wall. Then she looked at the floor at the base of the north wall, where the dirt had packed hard over decades of use. At the border between the wall and the floor, to barely visible in the low light, she noticed something she had not noticed before. A slight irregularity in the dirt, a line almost perfectly straight, running parallel to the base of the wall at a distance of perhaps 18 inches, as though something had once stood there and had, over time, been covered by the gradual compression of the earth, as though something had once stood there and then been incorporated into the wall itself. She knelt. She pressed her palm flat against the dirt floor, feeling its cold hardness, its stillness, its way of being absolutely quiet in the way that only the ground can be quiet, holding everything beneath it without sound or movement or any acknowledgement of what it contains. The cold came up through her palm and into her hand, and she knelt there in the smokehouse while the afternoon light moved toward its early November conclusion, and the crow out in the pasture went quiet, and the vine on the south wall moved once in the wind and then was still. Be patient with the smokehouse. It rewards patience. She stood up. She went back to her car and retrieved the flashlight from the glove compartment and the folding knife from the pocket of her bag, an old habit from years of working in environments where you learn to carry things that could help you understand your situation more precisely. She went back inside the smokehouse. She was not ready to begin yet. Not tonight. The light was going, and she needed tools she didn't have with her, and she needed to think clearly about what she was looking at before she put her hands on it. Old structures could be fragile in non-obvious ways, and she had the intuition, more than intuition, something in the quality of what she was seeing, the precision of that mortar, the deliberateness of those straight-laid bricks, that this was not something to approach carelessly. But she stood in the doorway of the smokehouse for another long moment before she pulled it shut and replaced the padlock, and she played the flashlight beam across the north wall one more time, running it slowly across the surface, watching the way the light fell on the mortar lines. In the center section, that zone between chest height and floor, 3 feet wide, on 4 feet tall, the mortar lines were, if anything, even more precise than the rest, more careful. The bricks here were laid with the slight extra deliberateness of someone who wanted to be sure a thing would hold, who wanted to be sure it would not give way accidentally, that it would not yield to anything less than a specific and purposeful effort. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the sudden dark for a moment. Then she replaced the padlock, walked back up through the depression to her car, and drove toward June Purdy's house, where Lily was waiting with Captain and the smell of cinnamon rolls and the particular grace of someone who has spent 70-odd years understanding what people need without waiting to be told. She drove through the valley with the dark coming over the mountains from the east and the cold settling into the low places along the road. And she drove the whole way with the note folded against her chest and the key in her coat pocket and that hum in the back of her mind that had started in the conference room and had not stopped. If anything, had grown louder, more insistent. And she thought about mortar and brick and the careful, deliberate hands of a man she had never met who had built something in the 1930s and had built it, she was beginning to believe, with a very specific intention. 4, 14, 37. An inner lock. She drove through the dark and the cold, and did not yet know what was behind the north wall of the smokehouse that her grandfather had built on the edge of the family land in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia in the 4th decade of the 20th century, and which her father had left to her, and which her brothers had laughed at in the conference room of Kessler and Pratt, while Sandra waited in the outer room and the lotto sign pealed in the wind outside the window. She did not yet know, but she was beginning to suspect, and the suspicion, unlike so many of the things she had been carrying in recent years, did not feel like weight. It felt like something else entirely. She did not sleep well at June Purdy's house, which was not June's fault. June had given her the guest room at the end of the hall, a small, warm room with a quilt in a pattern of interlocking circles, and a nightstand with a reading lamp and a glass of water left there without being asked, which was the kind of careful, unannounced attention that June had always practiced, and which Nora found, as she always had, both enormously comforting and faintly unbearable in the way that kindness sometimes is when you have been operating without it for long enough that receiving it feels like being handed something fragile you are not sure you can hold. She lay under the quilt and looked at the ceiling, which was smooth and cream-colored and unremarkable, and she thought about mortar. She had spent the drive from the smokehouse to June's house not allowing herself to think about it, concentrating instead on the road, on the particular dark of a November evening in the valley, on the heat coming through the car's vents, and the familiar weight of the key in her coat pocket. She had been very deliberate about that, the not thinking, because she had learned over the years that thinking about certain things too soon was a form of damage, that you could spend a hope before it had a chance to become real, could wear it out in the anticipation, could arrive at the moment of its verification already exhausted by the imagining of it. But now, in the dark of June's guest room, with Lily sleeping across the hall and Captain propped against the nightstand because Lily had insisted he be where Nora could see him, she let herself think. The north wall of the smokehouse was approximately 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall at its highest point. A structure of that size, built in that era, with the kind of careful attention to mortar quality and brick placement that she had observed, was not built by a man who had done it accidentally or carelessly. Her grandfather, she had gathered very little about him over the years, because he had died before she was born, and Harold Calloway had not been a man who talked easily about his own parents, had been, according to the few things she'd been told, a man of exacting habits, a craftsman in the old sense, someone who could look at a joint or a seam and tell you not only whether it was right, but why, precisely, it was right or wrong, and what would have to be done to make it otherwise. A man like that does not build a false wall by accident. She turned onto her side and looked at the glass of water on the nightstand and thought about the combination her father had written down. For 1437, April 14th, 1937. A birthday, her father had said, her grandfather's birthday. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. If he had been born in 1937 and had built the smokehouse, which property records placed in the early 1930s based on when the parcel had been surveyed, then he had not been born yet when the smokehouse was first constructed, which meant the false wall had not been part of the original structure. It had been added, after the fact, by a man who knew the building well enough to replicate its brickwork, convincingly enough to deceive anyone who was not looking with the particular close attention of someone who already suspected something was there. She thought about the inner lock her father had mentioned. The combination. An inner lock meant something on the other side of the wall, something accessible but protected. Not simply a void space behind the brickwork, sealed forever. A door, or the equivalent of one. Something designed to be entered by someone with the right numbers, at the right time, with the right reason. She thought about what her father had written. I could not find the words while I was living. She thought about her letter on his nightstand. She thought about the 9 years of silence and the things that fill silence when there is nothing else to fill it with, which are mostly regret and its cousins. She closed her eyes. Outside, the valley was dark and cold and still in the way it is in November when the visitors are gone and the land settles into itself and the mountains go quiet and blue against the sky. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of wind in the trees behind June's house, and it was a sound she knew from childhood. Not the same trees, but the same wind, the same mountains giving it shape and direction, the same Shenandoah cold that made it particular to this place, and no other. She slept some time before midnight. She dreamed of the smokehouse, which is not the kind of dream that announces itself as meaningful. It was just the room, the smell, the north wall, and its careful brickwork. But she woke with the feeling of it still on her. the specific sensation of standing in that space and understanding that the wall was doing something other than holding up a roof. June made breakfast at 7. Eggs from the chickens she kept in a small coop behind the house. Toast from bread she'd baked herself. Coffee that tasted like coffee rather than almost coffee. Lily ate 2 plates and told June the story of a book she was reading at school with a seriousness of detail that suggested she was either a natural raconteur or a child who understood instinctively that adults in the process of listening were adults not asking difficult questions. Probably both. Nora drank the coffee and ate the eggs and watched her daughter and felt the specific quality of gratitude that comes not from something given, but from something witnessed. The uncomplicated pleasure of Lily being happy in a warm kitchen, which cost nothing and was worth everything. After breakfast, she told June she needed a few hours at the farm, that she'd be back by afternoon. June said, of course, that she and Lily would see about the chickens, at which Lily received as though it were the announcement of an expedition to a foreign country, and immediately went to find her coat. Nora drove to the hardware store in Waynesboro first. She bought a cold chisel, medium width, a ball-peen hammer, 16 ounce, a pry bar, 18 inch, a stiff bristle brush, a tube of dental pick tool, the kind used for detailed work in small spaces, which she found in the tile section, and which she took not because she was certain she would need it, but because you never knew what level of precision a task would require until you were in the middle of it. She also bought 2 heavy flashlights with fresh batteries, because the single flashlight from her glove compartment had been adequate for a first look, but would not be adequate for what she intended to do now. She spent $31 of the $47. She paid in cash without looking at the total until after she'd handed the bills over, which was a technique she'd developed for situations in which the alternative was not buying the things. She drove to the farm on the Eastern Service Road and parked where she'd parked the day before, at the end of the wheel tracks. She took the tools from the back seat and carried them in 2 hands down through the depression to the smokehouse. The morning was cold, colder than the previous afternoon, with a low sky the color of old pewter and a smell of coming weather. Not rain, but the particular dense, metallic quality of the air before snow. She unlocked the padlock and pushed the door open. The smokehouse in the morning light looked different from the afternoon. Not that the light came through the ventilation slits differently, lower and more lateral, throwing long shadows across the brick floor of the fire pit and illuminating the hooks above in a way that made them look more insistent, more functional, as though they had been waiting to be useful again. The smell was the same, char and salt, and that mineral undertone she had noticed the day before, which now, standing in it again, she was even more certain was real and specific, rather than imagined. She set the tools on the floor near the east wall and stood in front of the north wall. In the morning light, it was easier to see the differences she had noticed the evening before. The mortar variation was clearer, not dramatic, not something you would notice if you were simply walking through a building you already knew, but present and unambiguous once you were looking for it. She ran her hand along the mortar lines from the east edge of the north wall toward the center, feeling the slight texture change as she crossed what she was increasingly certain was the junction between the original wall and whatever had been added to it. She tapped again, systematically this time, moving across the wall in a grid pattern, 3 heights, low, middle, high, at intervals of roughly 18 inches from left to right. She listened carefully to each tap. The change in resonance was still there, still centered on that zone roughly 3 feet wide, beginning about 2 feet from the floor and extending to about 6 feet, the full height at which a man might comfortably work while standing. She crouched at the base of the wall and examined the floor line again. The line she had noticed the evening before was still there, that almost imperceptible ridge in the packed dirt, running parallel to the wall's base. In the morning light, she could see it more clearly. It was not a line of disturbance, but a line of absence, a place where the floor surface was very slightly lower than on either side, as though the earth had once been cut along that line and then restored, and had settled fractionally differently over the decades since. This was the trace of a seam, the joint between original floor and the floor that had been prepared to accommodate whatever stood behind the wall. She picked up the stiff brush and swept dust and debris away from the floor at the base of the center section, working carefully, uncovering the packed earth down to where it was firmer and less disturbed. When she had cleared a strip about 4 feet wide and 12 inches deep from the wall's base, she could see the line more clearly, a slight irregularity in the surface that ran the full width of the center section with the precision of something that had been deliberately cut. She stood, picked up the cold chisel and hammer, and placed the chisel against the mortar joint she'd identified as the likely right-hand boundary of the false section, the point where the later brickwork met the original wall. She held the chisel at a slight angle, the way you do when you want to test a joint rather than demolish it, and tapped once with the hammer. The mortar was hard, harder than the old mortar in the other walls, but not the hardness of absolute integrity. The hardness of something that has been made to appear like the original material, might have approximately the same composition, but which had been mixed by someone working by estimation rather than with the specific knowledge of what the original mix had contained. It was close, but not identical, and under the chisel's edge, it fractured differently, along a line rather than crumbling outward, which meant it was slightly more brittle in its matrix, slightly more prone to clean separation than to powdering. She worked carefully. This was not the work of someone trying to demolish a wall. It was the work of someone trying to understand one. She chiseled lightly at the mortar along the vertical joint line, testing its depth, feeling how far the chisel would go before it met resistance. After a few inches, the joint began to reveal itself. The mortar here was not the full thickness of the surrounding joints. It was a facing, a layer applied to the outer surface of a gap rather than filling it completely, a cosmetic measure designed to make the seam invisible to casual inspection. She stepped back and recalculated what she was seeing. The false section of the wall was not built as a separate panel inserted into the original wall. It had been built as a complete section of wall, separate from the original structure, and then the gap between them, the gap that represented the depth of whatever space lay on the other side, had been faced on both the visible right and left joints with matching mortar to seal the visual appearance of a continuous, uniform wall. The bricks she was looking at were the front face of an independent structure that stood against the original north wall of the smokehouse, but was not of it, which meant behind this facing there was a space, not a small space. The facing she was examining extended a full 4 feet left from the right-hand seam before she could identify what appeared to be a corresponding seam on the left. The center section was approximately 4 feet wide, and the depth would be determined by how far back the supporting wall was built, far enough to be structurally independent, which at minimum would be 1 brick width, roughly 8 inches, but possibly more. Possibly considerably more. She worked along the right-hand seam with the chisel, clearing the facing mortar in sections, revealing as she went the edge of the facing brickwork and the gap behind it. First a sliver of darkness, then, as she cleared more of the facing, a gap of perhaps a 1/4 inch, then half an inch, then an inch, on the darkness of it, absolute, smelling of cold and old stone and that mineral quality she had been sensing since she first opened the smokehouse door. She fitted the blade of the pry bar into the gap and applied gentle, even pressure. The facing shifted almost immediately. It was not attached to the original wall behind it, only to the facing brickwork she was already working. Under steady pressure, the section moved. Not much, half an inch, then an inch. Then the right-hand section of the facing was clear of the original wall by 2 inches, the gap wide enough for her to fit 2 fingers into. She paused and took a breath. The cold of the smokehouse was significant now. She could see her breath clearly. Small clouds appearing and vanishing in the beam of the flashlight she'd propped against the fire pit to illuminate her work. The sounds from outside were minimal. The wind, occasional, and somewhere very distant the sound of farm machinery, probably on one of the surrounding properties, a sound that came and went with the wind's direction. She moved to the left-hand seam and repeated the process, working the chisel carefully along the joint, clearing the facing, revealing the gap. When she had the left side freed to a similar degree, she replaced the chisel with the pry bar and began working the entire facing section, applying pressure at the right side, then the left, then the right again, a slow rockin' motion that worked the facing away from whatever it was resting against, fraction by fraction, like a drawer stuck from humidity that releases not all at once, but by degrees, each small yield encouraging the next. The facing moved, a 1/4 inch, a half. A 1 inch total separation on both sides, the gap now wide enough that she could see into it with the flashlight. A narrow strip of interior wall, old brick, the same as the outside of the smokehouse, dimly lit by the flashlight beam from an angle that revealed nothing of what lay beyond. She pressed her palm flat against the center of the facing and pushed steadily. The facing shifted another half inch and then stopped. Stopped in the way of something resting against an obstruction, not in the way of something locked. She crouched and examined the floor at the base of the facing. There was debris, old dirt, accumulated in the gap over decades. She swept it away with the brush, revealing a floor joint below the facing that had the same slightly lower surface she'd noted along the full base of the center section. And the facing was resting partly on accumulated floor debris. She swept more carefully, working the brush into the gap, clearing the floor joint as thoroughly as she could from outside. Then she stood and pressed again. This time the facing moved more freely. 2 inches of total separation. 3, the gap now wide enough that she could put her hand through it and feel what was on the other side. She did not put her hand through. Not yet. She took a step back and evaluated. The facing was a single section of brickwork, approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, set into the original wall, opening as a panel. It had been built to swing, not on hinges in the conventional sense, but by design. The facing was heavy enough to stay in place under its own weight when flush with the surrounding wall, so it could be moved by applying steady pressure once the cosmetic mortar seal at the edges was broken. This was the inner door her father had referenced. Not a door in any conventional sense, but a door in the craftsman's sense. A thing designed to open, to admit, to allow passage. Built by a man who understood that the most secure lock is one that nobody can see. She found what she was looking for when she looked at the right edge of the facing section more carefully. Just inside the gap, at approximately chest height, a small iron fitting was mounted to the inner surface of the facing brickwork, not visible from the outside when the facing was flush with the wall, but now, with 2 inches of separation, accessible. The fitting was the size and shape of a small safe lock, a circular dial, 4 inches across, iron, its surface worn to a dull gray sheen by decades of protection from the air in the enclosed space. The dial was numbered around its circumference, the numbers stamped rather than cast, still legible, 0 through 40, marked at intervals of 2. There was a central post through which a locking bar ran, and the bar, she could see, passed through the facing section and engaged with a catch on the original wall behind it. The combination lock, the inner lock her father had written about. 4, 14, 37. She wiped her hands on her jeans, which accomplished nothing functionally, but which was the kind of preparatory gesture you make before a moment that requires your full attention. She fitted her right hand into the gap and rested her fingers on the dial. The iron was cold enough to sting. She turned the dial to 0, or then began the sequence. 4 full clockwise rotations, stopping on 4. 3 counterclockwise rotations, stopping on 14. 2 clockwise rotations, stopping on 37. The lock gave a sound she felt more than heard. A dense, mechanical click, transmitted through the facing section's mass, the sound of an engagement releasing after decades of patient waiting. She stepped back and placed both palms against the facing, applied steady, even pressure, and the entire section began to move. It moved more freely now, the lock released. The accumulated debris swept from the floor joint, the weight of it distributing across its own base in a rolling motion as she pushed. Steady, controlled, no hurry. The way you move something heavy and irreplaceable when you understand that you are responsible for it. And the facing swung inward, not hinged exactly, but balanced and weighted so that it pivoted on its base, swinging from left to right on the interior side, opening like a page being turned. The gap widened. 6 inches. 12. The cold air from inside rushed out, not the cold of the smokehouse, which was the cold of an unheated enclosed space, but a different cold, deeper, more stable. The cold of underground, the cold of spaces that have not been touched by weather or season in a very long time. She reached in through the gap and trained the flashlight ahead of her. The space on the other side of the facing was not the hollow void she had been half expecting. The empty chamber of disappointment, the space that had once held something now long gone, the cavity that yielded nothing more than the evidence of what had been removed. It was a room, a full room, small, perhaps 8 feet by 12, with the same brick walls as the smokehouse on 3 sides, and a ceiling of heavy timber beams supporting what appeared to be the underside of the smokehouse's north wall above. The floor was stone, flagstone, laid in irregular pieces with tight-fit joints, flat and level, the work of a man who understood that a floor that holds weight needs a foundation that does not shift. The flashlight beam moved across the room in a slow arc, and for a moment, Nora Calloway stood at the threshold of the opened facing section, one hand on the edge, the other holding the flashlight, and simply looked. Along the left-hand wall, floor to ceiling, stood wooden shelving, heavy-duty, constructed of thick timber planks mounted on iron brackets, driven directly into the mortar between the bricks. The shelving was intact. The wood was dark with age, and with the particular dry preservation of an enclosed, cold, low-humidity space that had been sealed from the outside air for an extended period. And on the shelving, on every shelf, from the lowest to the highest, arranged with a precision that reflected the same careful character evident in the wall's construction, were objects. She could not, from the threshold, make out precisely what every shelf contained. The flashlight beam at this angle illuminated some things clearly and left others in shadow. What she could see clearly on the second shelf from the floor were rectangular shapes, stacked horizontally, each one roughly the size of a hardcover book, each one wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth, a dark, waxy material that had been tied with twine and which had preserved its integrity across the decades with remarkable success. She counted the shapes she could see, 12 on the second shelf alone, each one approximately 10 inches long, 4 inches wide, 2 inches thick. The dimensions of a standard gold ingot. Her hand tightened on the edge of the facing section. On the shelf above, partially in shadow, she could make out the edges of what appeared to be flat wooden boxes, the kind used historically for storing currency or documents. Their lids fitted with small iron latches, the wood darkened but not rotted, preserved by the same dry cold that had kept the shelves intact. She counted 6 on that shelf before the angle of the flashlight made counting more difficult. So on the top shelf, at the very edge of the beam's reach, she could see what appeared to be rolls, cylindrical forms, each perhaps 18 inches long and 6 inches in diameter, wrapped in a protective material she could not immediately identify from this distance. There were many of them. She counted to 20 before the beam didn't reach further, and she stopped counting. She stood at the threshold for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt like something that had no relationship to clock time. The cold from the room moved against her face. The smell of it reached her fully now. That mineral coldness, yes, but also the smell of old metal and old paper, and the specific, complex, particular smell of things that have been stored with care in the proper conditions and have survived intact, which is a smell that is almost impossible to describe, but which carries within it the entire weight of the word preservation. She stepped through the opening. The flagstone floor was solid and cold under her boots, each piece fitted so tightly to its neighbors that there was no give, no settling, no evidence of subsidence in what must have been. She was calculating rapidly and imprecisely, at least 80 years of undisturbed standing. She moved to the left wall and crouched in front of the second shelf and brought the flashlight close to the nearest oilcloth-wrapped rectangle. The oilcloth was tied with a length of tarred twine, a knot at the top that had constricted over the decades into something that required the dental pick tool she'd brought to work, loose carefully without tearing the wrapping. And she worked the pick under the knot's edge, applied gentle pressure, and the knot yielded, not crumbling, not falling apart, but releasing in the way of something that was still structurally sound, but had simply been waiting for the right effort to address it. She unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside was a layer of cloth, a heavy canvas weave, tightly woven, which had been wrapped around the interior contents as an additional layer of protection. She unrolled the canvas. What was inside was a bar of metal, approximately the dimensions she had estimated from across the room, 10 inches by 4 inches by 2 inches, with a surface that had the slightly dull, non-reflective quality of metal that has been cleaned of all oxidation and then sealed, and which was, unmistakably, the specific color and weight and character of gold. She turned it over in her hands. On the top face, stamped into the metal, were a series of markings, a maker's stamp she did not recognize, a purity mark, and a date. The date read, 1932. She set it down on the flagstone floor beside her and sat on her heels and looked at it for a moment. The flashlight was propped against the shelf above her, throwing its beam at an angle that illuminated the bar from the side and cast a small, sharp shadow across the markings on its face. She breathed in, breathed out. The cold of the room moved around her. She reached for the next oilcloth package on the shelf. Identical. Same dimensions, same wrapping, same canvas liner. The bar inside, gold, same purity mark, dated 1933. She set it beside the first. She opened a third. Gold, 1932. She opened a fourth. Gold, 1931. When she stopped opening packages, she stood and counted them, counted the wrapped rectangles on the second shelf, which was the shelf she'd begun with, moving the flashlight along them slowly, counting each shape. 14 on this shelf, 14 individual packages, each approximately the dimensions and weight of a standard gold bar, each wrapped with the care of a man who intended them to remain as he left them, regardless of how long that took. She moved the flashlight to the shelf below, the bottom shelf. More packages, different shapes, some the same rectangular form as the bars on the second shelf, but others flatter, wider, approximately the dimensions of a legal envelope, but considerably thicker. She opened one of the flatter packages. Inside, protected by the oilcloth, and then by a layer of heavy wax paper that had been applied on top of the canvas and which had kept the interior entirely moisture-free, was a stack of papers. She lifted them out with both hands, understanding immediately from their weight and texture that they were not ordinary papers. They were currency, banknotes from the look of them, but older than any currency she had handled in her life, their surfaces covered in an elaborate engraving of a style she associated with federal certificates and bonds from an earlier era. She brought one sheet close to the flashlight. It was a bearer bond. Federal issue, dated 1929. Its face value was stated clearly in the lower right corner of the certificate in printed figures. $10,000. She looked at the stack in her hands. She counted approximately 30 sheets. She set the stack back on the shelf with the same care she had used to remove it, and then she pressed her back against the opposite wall and stood very still in the cold room and looked at the shelving in front of her. The left wall with its heavy wooden shelves, its 14 gold bars on the second shelf, its stack of bearer bonds in the flat package below, its cylindrical wrapped rolls on the upper shelves that she had not yet opened. She looked at the flat wooden boxes on the third shelf with their iron latches. She looked at the methodical, patient, deliberate arrangement of it all. An old man's care made permanent in a sealed room beneath a Virginia smokehouse, wrapped in oilcloth and canvas and wax paper and good intent, waiting for whoever he had decided should find it. She thought about the note her father had written. He was not a man who trusted complicated things. No, he was not. He had trusted bricks and mortar and good quality wrapping and the right combination lock and the correct person, eventually, given enough time. He had trusted all of those things, and they had held. Every one of them had held. She pushed herself off the wall and walked to the wooden boxes on the third shelf. There were 6 of them, each approximately the size of a document storage box, fitted with the small iron latches. She opened the nearest one. Inside, nested in a bed of dry cedar shavings that had retained their scent across the decades, the sharp, resinous smell of cedar, unmistakable, rising from the open box in a wave that seemed improbably vivid, were coins. Not a scatter of loose coins, but rolls of coins, unwrapped in paper in the manner of a bank teller's roll, each roll labeled in a handwriting she did not recognize, with a denomination and what appeared to be a date range. She unrolled one of the paper wrappers. The coins inside were gold. Small, flat, their surfaces clear and detailed in the flashlight beam, their edges perfectly milled, the kind of detail that speaks to a very early production date, when minting technology was at its finest and the standards for precious metal content were absolute and uncompromising. Gold coins, pre-Depression gold coins, accumulated before 1933, which was the year the federal government had recalled them. Accumulated before that date, sealed in this room before that date, and preserved through the long decades while their legal status changed around them, and the world they had been minted in transformed into something their original owner would have found unrecognizable. She opened a second box. More coin rolls. She opened a third. More rolls, and beneath them, wrapped individually in the same oilcloth material as the bars, 4 more flat objects of the dimensions of the bearer bonds. She opened one. A certificate, different from the bonds. This one, a stock certificate, the corporate name in elaborate type across the top. She did not recognize the company name immediately, but the certificate was for a quantity of shares and bore a valuation date in the 1920s and carried the kind of elaborate engraved border that suggested it had been considered, at the time of its issuance, a document of significant value. She set it carefully back in its wrapping and closed the box. She looked at the cylindrical rolls on the top shelf. She had to stand on her toes to reach them, the shelf being at the very top of the structure, perhaps 7 feet from the flagstone floor. She brought one down carefully, setting it on the second shelf to examine it. The outer wrapping was a heavy-duty oilskin canvas, wound around the roll and tied at each end, with the same tarred twine she'd encountered on the rectangular packages. She worked the knots loose with the pick tool, unwound the canvas, and unrolled the contents. What emerged was a painting on canvas, approximately 24 inches by 36, rolled with the painted surface facing inward to protect it, and interleaved with a layer of very thin cotton batting that had prevented the rolled canvas from sticking to itself or cracking through the decades of compression. She unrolled it as far as she dared, without better lighting or a flat surface. But even in the partial unrolling, in the beam of the flashlight held by her left hand, while her right steadied the canvas, she could see oil paint, applied with skill and precision, a figurative composition, a figure in a landscape, the color still remarkably present despite the age, the deep greens and ochres of what appeared to be a European pastoral scene, the figure in the middle ground, wearing clothing of an earlier century. She rolled it back up carefully, rewound the oilskin, and laid it on the shelf below with the same attention she would have given something she knew to be enormously fragile. Then she sat down on the flagstone floor, which was very cold, and held the flashlight in her lap and looked at the wall of shelving in front of her, and she stayed like that for a long time. The drive back to June Purdy's house was the strangest drive of her life. Not because anything about it was unusual. The road was the same. The valley was the same. The mountains stood in their accustomed positions, and the pewter sky had not changed, and the smell of coming snow was still in the air. It was strange because she was different, and the world had not yet caught up with the fact. She had closed the facing section behind her when she left, had worked it back into position as carefully as she had opened it. She had reset the combination lock, spinning the dial 3 times past 0 to clear the sequence. She had replaced the padlock on the outer door. She had carried the tools back to her car in 2 trips, setting them in the back seat, and she had sat in the car for several minutes before starting the engine. Not because she couldn't think of what to do next, but because she needed to let what she had just seen settle into a form she could actually hold. She had been in that room for 4 hours. She had opened and re-examined every wrapped package on every shelf. She had counted everything she could count with reliable accuracy, and estimated what she could not count with complete confidence. She had sketched on the back of the hardware store receipt, using the pencil she found at the bottom of her coat pocket, for a rough inventory, not with numbers yet, because she did not know enough to put numbers to most of what she had seen, but with categories, each category represented by a brief word and a rough count. Bars, 14 confirmed. Estimated 12 more based on the consistency of the other packages on the same shelf. Coins, 6 boxes, each containing between 40 and 60 rolls, each roll containing between 10 and 20 coins. Bonds, 30 confirmed sheets, estimated additional in the remaining flat packages. Paintings. She could see, now that she had brought the second flashlight to bear on the top shelf, that there were at least 22 cylindrical rolls. And then, in the corner of the room, she had not noticed until her 3rd hour inside, behind the bottom shelf, which she had to move forward slightly, so discovering that it was on wheels, old iron wheels that rolled on a track set into the flagstone, a secondary section of floor, a lower section, in which were set into the flagstone 6 large iron strong boxes of the kind used in the late 19th and early 20th century for the storage of important documents or cash, each one locked with a key lock rather than a combination. She did not have those keys. She had written the word strong boxes on her hardware store receipt and drawn a box around it and put a question mark next to it. Then she had drawn a second box around the first box because the habit of containing uncertainty is one she had developed over years of living on margins, and it was a hard habit to break even when uncertainty had taken on a different character than it ever had before. She drove back through the valley and tried to think practically. She had just found something extraordinary inside a crumbling brick smokehouse on a piece of land her brothers had openly dismissed as worthless. She had found it alone, in a room that nobody else currently knew about. The property was hers, legally, verifiably hers, deeded to her by her father, and recorded by Gerald Pratt, with the clean documentation of a man who made his living on the precision of such things. Whatever was in that room was on her land, in a structure belonging to her, and had been left to her, explicitly, by her father, who had been left it in turn by his father, who had built it and sealed it, and used a birthday that nobody would have had reason to guess as the combination. She thought about the next step, with the same methodical attention she had applied to the mortar and the facing and the inventory. She needed an appraiser. Someone qualified to evaluate gold bars, rare coins, paper instruments, and oil paintings. Someone who understood the difference between assessment and acquisition, who could give her accurate valuations without immediately attempting to leverage the transaction. She needed a lawyer, not Gerald Pratt, who was the estate's attorney and whose obligations ran to the estate as a whole, but her own attorney, someone whose obligations ran only to her. She needed both of those people before she told anyone else what she had found, because she had the intuition. The same quiet, accurate, a mineral-dense intuition that had served her through 3 years of $47 weeks and past due notices and almost coffee. That the moment other people knew what was in that room, the situation would change in ways she could not yet predict. She also knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not drive this 2 hours back to Millhaven without telling Lily. Not because Lily was old enough to understand the financial specifics, but because Lily was hers, her daughter, her person, the one she had been holding the line for through all of the $47 mornings. And the line had just moved, and she was not going to move it without Lily knowing that the ground had shifted. She pulled into June Purdy's driveway and sat in the car. Saw through the kitchen window she could see the light on and the shapes of June and Lily moving inside, and she could hear, faintly, through the car's glass, what sounded like Lily's voice in the particular register it reached when she was telling a story she considered important, which was most stories. The window framed them warmly. The cold outside was definite, and the light inside was the specific amber of a kitchen in late afternoon that holds people in it the way a painting holds a scene. Captured, sufficient, for a moment entirely enough. Nora sat in the car and looked at that window for a moment. She thought about the river stone on the dresser in her apartment in Millhaven, next to the stack of bills. She thought about the $47 and what remained of it after the hardware store. She thought about the past due electric notice and the laundry service, and the manager who was not sure he could hold her position for 4 days. She thought about Lily sleeping on the pull-out sofa, and Captain the stuffed horse, and the narrow apartment where the stain on the ceiling looked like nothing, and the radiator knocked every morning, and the matches in the drawer next to the broken igniter were the daily evidence of making do with what you had rather than what you needed. She thought about the room behind the wall, the flagstone floor, and the wooden shelving, and the oilcloth packages, and the cedar smell from the coin boxes, and the painting she had unrolled partially, carefully, holding it in both hands in the cold light of the flashlight, while the valley outside sat still and quiet in the November air. She thought about her grandfather, who had been born on April 14th, 1937, which was not before the Depression was over, but was during the long process of climbing out of it, that was, depending on where you lived and who you were, barely distinguishable from the Depression itself. A man who built things with his hands, and trusted brick and mortar, and oilcloth, and a dial on a lock, and the right person with the right key at the right time. She wondered if he had known she existed, specifically, had imagined her, had thought about who would eventually open that wall. Probably not. Probably he had imagined someone more like himself, someone from the valley, someone with calloused hands and an instinct for the land. He had built it as a gift for his bloodline, a legacy of the particular kind that carries itself through sealed rooms and combination locks rather than through words or gestures, because he was not, apparently, a man who trusted complicated things. And yet, here she was, his granddaughter. With calloused hands from a different kind of work and an instinct that had carried her, through a broken lock and a chisel and a pry bar and 4 hours of systematic examination, to the flagstone floor of a room that had been waiting 80 years for exactly this. She got out of the car. She walked up to June Purdy's front door and knocked twice, which was the signal she and Lily had agreed meant everything is fine and dinner is still on. She heard Lily's voice change register, the story stopping mid-sentence, and the sound of small feet running toward the door. The door opened, and Lily looked up at her with those dark eyes that were her father's, but the expression in them that was entirely Nora's, the look that assesses a situation quickly and accurately before committing to a response, and said, "How is the smokehouse?" Nora crouched down to her daughter's eye level, which she did sometimes when the thing she was about to say was important enough to require that kind of attention, and she looked at Lily's face for a moment. Lily waited with the patience of a child who has been taught by circumstance to wait. "The smokehouse," Nora said quietly, "is a very good smokehouse." Lily absorbed this. "What does that mean?" "It means," Nora said, "that Grandpa left us something more than a brick building." Lily's eyes shifted slightly, recalibrating. She looked at her mother's face the way she always looked at it, when she was trying to read the level of the thing behind the words, the way she had learned to do, because there had been enough times when the level mattered very much to the actual content of what was going to happen next. Whatever she saw there satisfied her. She nodded once, with the seriousness of someone concluding a complex negotiation, and stepped back to let her mother inside. "June made pie," she said, which was her way of indicating that the important things were in order, and the rest could be addressed in due time. She called Gerald Pratt that evening from the guest room, while Lily slept down the hall. The call was brief. No, she told him she needed a referral for a private attorney, someone not connected to the estate, and the name of a reputable independent appraiser in the region. Gerald Pratt, to his credit, did not ask why. He had been a lawyer for 35 years, and he had learned, as lawyers do, to sense the shape of a situation from the quality of the question rather than its content. And the quality of Nora Calloway's question told him that the situation had changed in a way he had not anticipated from the reading of Harold Calloway's will. He gave her 2 names. The attorney was a woman named Clara Finch in Harrisonburg. The appraiser was a man named Edward Bauer, who operated an authentication and estate valuation service that had worked with every significant estate sale in the valley for the past 25 years. She called Clara Finch the next morning at 7:58, 2 minutes before the office opened. She left a message that said, "I have inherited a property in Waynesboro County. I have reason to believe it contains significant assets that predate the current estate documentation. I need legal representation immediately." She left her number and hung up. Clara Finch called back in 11 minutes. She drove to Harrisonburg that afternoon with the deed and the note from her father and the hardware store receipt, with its rough inventory and pencil. And she sat across the desk from Clara Finch, who was 57 years old, with reading glasses pushed to the top of her head and a way of listening that made you feel that every word you said was being permanently archived in a system of exceptional reliability. Nora told her everything. She told it in the same methodical way she had performed the examination in the smokehouse, in order, with specific detail, without embellishment, and without understatement. She described the wall, the mortar, the facing section, the combination lock, the room, the shelving, the oilcloth packages, the bars, the bonds, the coins, the paintings, and the strong boxes in the corner, whose keys she did not have. When she finished, Clara Finch was quiet for a moment. Then she uncapped her pen and said, "All right. Let's make sure nobody touches that room until we know exactly what we're dealing with." She called Edward Bauer from Clara Finch's office. He was available the following morning. She did not sleep again that night, or not much. She lay in the guest room under the quilt of interlocking circles, and the river stone sat on June's nightstand, where she'd put it when she unpacked her bag, and she looked at the ceiling and let the magnitude of what she had found exist in her mind, without trying to make it smaller or larger than it was. This was not a thing she could yet attach numbers to with any confidence. She had opened 14 gold bars and confirmed their character. She had opened 1 stack of bearer bonds and counted 30 certificates at $10,000 face value each. She had partially unrolled 1 painting. She had opened 3 of the 6 coin boxes and confirmed their contents. She had not opened the strong boxes. She had not touched many of the packages on the upper shelves. She had seen enough to know that what was in that room was not merely significant. She had seen enough to know that it was the kind of thing that changes the terms of a person's life completely. Not incrementally, not by degree, but wholesale. The way a river changes course, not moving slightly in a new direction, but relocating entirely, establishing a new channel, leaving the old one dry. She did not let herself imagine the number yet. That was for tomorrow, for Edward Bauer, with his decades of experience and his authentication protocols. That was for Clara Finch, with her legal frameworks and her archiving system. That was for people who knew how to put accurate values on things that had waited 80 years to be valued. What she did let herself imagine, lying there in the cold dark of the guest room with Lily breathing steadily down the hall, was simpler and more particular than any number. She imagined paying the electric bill, not with anxiety, not with the calculation that had preceded every similar payment for the past 3 years, but simply paying it, presenting the amount being paid, the service being restored to its normal status, without the red border of past due coloring the experience. She imagined this with the kind of careful deliberateness with which you imagine things you do not yet fully believe are coming, but which the evidence is beginning to insist upon. She imagined taking Lily to the dentist. Lily had been complaining about a back tooth for 3 weeks. Nora had been making the appointment in her mind for 3 weeks and not making it with a phone because the copay was $65, and there had not yet been a week in which $65 was available without displacing something else that equally needed to be displaced. She imagined a room, not a house yet. A house was too large, required too much imagination in one sitting. But a room, a real room belonging to Lily, with walls and a door and a window and a floor that was not a pull-out sofa. A room where Captain could sit on a shelf and not worry about being stepped on in the middle of the night by a mother navigating a dark apartment between the bed and the bathroom. These were small thoughts. In proportion to what she had found in that sealed room, they were very small thoughts. But they were also the right thoughts, and the ones that connected the magnitude of the thing to the specific reality of the life she had been living. And she lay in June Purdy's guest room and held them in the dark with something that was not quite happiness, was something older and quieter and more fundamental than happiness, and let herself carefully believe. Edward Bauer arrived at the Smokehouse the next morning at 9 o'clock in a truck that was older than its condition suggested, carrying 2 hard-sided cases and the particular deliberate unhurriedness of a man who has spent his professional life arriving at places where extraordinary things have been found, and who has learned that rushing toward them does not serve anyone well. He was in his mid-60s, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck, and gloved hands that he had put on before getting out of the truck, or which told Nora immediately that he was the right person. Clara Finch was there too, standing to the side of the door with her notepad and her carefully neutral expression, and the presence of someone who was there not to observe, but to witness, which is a different thing. Nora opened the padlock. She led them inside. She worked the combination lock. She applied pressure to the facing and swung it open. Edward Bauer stepped into the room and stood still for approximately 15 seconds, which is the longest 15 seconds Nora had ever experienced. And then he said, very quietly, the way you say something when you are not certain your voice will hold its normal register, "My God." He set his cases down on the flagstone floor and opened them. Inside were UV lights, magnification instruments, specific chemical test kits, a scale, a reference catalogs, and an iPad, preloaded with international auction databases and metals verification charts. He began, methodically, and without any visible agitation, to examine the contents of the room. He worked for 6 hours. Nora and Clara Finch sat on folding camp chairs they had brought from the truck and watched, and occasionally Clara asked a question, and Edward answered it, and occasionally Nora asked a question, and he answered that too. And the answers, as the day moved through its midpoint and began its descent toward the early dark of November, began to accumulate into a portrait of what was in that room that was specific and detailed and accurate in a way that her pencil inventory on the hardware store receipt had not been able to be. The gold bars, 26 confirmed, key averaging 22 to 24 troy ounces each, purity consistently high, bearing marks consistent with several reputable American refinery operations active in the 1920s and 30s. Gold at current market price, Edward said quietly, running a figure on his calculator, and then pausing and running it again. He turned the calculator so she could read it. The figure had 7 digits. The bearer bonds, 42 confirmed. Face values between $5,000 and $25,000 each. These were more complex, he said. Bearer bonds from this era had a complicated legal history, following various court decisions about unclaimed assets. Clara wrote something. Edward said the bonds themselves, regardless of current legal enforceability, carried significant value as financial artifacts and collectibles, particularly in this state of preservation, which was extraordinary, and he circled a figure in one of his catalogs. The coins, the 6 boxes contained, upon full inventory, 473 gold coins ranging from pre-1933 common date coins to, in one roll in the 5th box, a sequence of coins whose dates and mint marks caused Edward Bauer to go very still, and then to take out his magnifying loupe, and then to consult his catalog, and then to sit down on the flagstone floor because there were no chairs nearby, and he apparently felt sitting was necessary. When he stood again, he said, carefully, that several of the coins in that particular roll were of a type and condition that he had not seen outside of a major auction house in 20 years, and that individual coins in their condition had sold at auction in the past 5 years for figures that ranged from several $100,000 to, in one documented case, just over $1.2 million per coin, and that he would need to verify with a numismatist before confirming, but that his preliminary assessment was that the coin section alone represented a value that exceeded anything else in the room. Nora looked at Clara. Clara wrote something and underlined it. The paintings, 22 rolls. He opened each one, unrolling them with gloved hands on the flat surface of the bottom shelf section after clearing it carefully. He examined each with the UV light and the magnifying lens. He said, after the 5th painting, that he believed he was looking at work from the Dutch and Flemish schools of the 17th century, that the canvas preparation and pigment composition were consistent with that era, that 2 of the paintings carried what appeared to be artists' signatures in the lower corners that would require specialist authentication, but which, if confirmed, would represent figures that he was reluctant to estimate without that confirmation. He opened all 22. He was quiet for a long time after the last one. Then he said that in his professional opinion, and subject to full authentication by appropriate specialists, the paintings represented the most significant single-location discovery of Old Master's works in American private estate history that he was aware of, and that if the attributions he suspected proved correct, the collection would be of international significance. Nora said, "How much?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be careful with this, because preliminary estimates in situations like this can be misleading in either direction, but with that caveat clearly stated." He picked up his calculator. He worked in silence for several minutes. He consulted his databases on the iPad, cross-referencing recent auction results. He wrote figures on a notepad, lined them up, made adjustments, and then set the pen down. The metals, coins, and instruments, taken together and subject to market conditions at time of sale, conservatively, and I mean conservatively, I'm looking at a floor of somewhere between $45 and $65 million. He paused. Outside, the November wind moved across the smokehouse roof and through the collapsed section where the tin had given way, and it made a sound through the chimney above them that was low and briefly musical, a note held for just a moment before the wind changed direction. "The paintings," Edward Bauer said, "if the attributions are what I believe they are a separate conversation, a very significant separate conversation." Clara Finch said, "How separate?" He looked at his notepad. He looked at the rolled canvases arranged on the shelf. He looked at Nora. "The 2 signed works," he said, "if authentication confirms what I think I'm seeing. Comparable works from the same attributed artists have sold at auction in recent years, in the range of $110 to $180 million each. The remaining 20 unsigned works, depending on attribution, range considerably. But if the collection as a whole proves to be what I believe it is, acquired perhaps during the 1920s, when European financial crisis drove prices dramatically down, and certain American buyers were in a position to acquire significant works at fractions of their actual value, if that's the provenance we're looking at." He stopped. He looked at the ceiling of the sealed room. $328 million, he said. "That is my preliminary estimate for the complete contents of this room, as a single collection with documented provenance. That is preliminary. That is subject to authentication. That could change. He looked at Nora. In either direction, he said. He said it as though the possibility of it changing downward was the responsible thing to flag. But in the quality of his silence after he said it, the way a man sits with what he has just said and does not try to take it back, Nora understood that Edward Bauer did not genuinely believe the number was going to go down. She sat in the cold room on the folding camp chair with her hands in her lap, and the flashlight standing on the floor between them, throwing its beam at the flagstone ceiling. And she looked at the north wall of her grandfather's sealed room, and she thought about nothing, specifically for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I see that calculator?" The news reached Dale on a Thursday. It did not reach him through Nora. She had made that decision deliberately, in the same quiet way she made most of her important decisions. Not with drama, not with the satisfaction of delivering the information herself and watching his face rearrange around it, but through the clean, inevitable channel of legal documentation. Clara Finch had filed the asset discovery with the county records office. The estate attorney, Gerald Pratt, received a copy as a matter of procedural courtesy. By the time Gerald Pratt called Dale, the paperwork was already public record, and the number on it, the preliminary valuation, $328 million, subject to full authentication, had already been read by a clerk who told a colleague who told her husband, who worked at the hardware store where Nora had bought her chisel and her pry bar 4 days earlier. Millhaven, Virginia is a small town. Waynesboro is smaller still. The valley has its own telegraph, and it runs faster than any system built by human hands. Dale called her that evening. She let it ring twice, then answered. He said her name. Then he was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who has prepared several openings to a conversation, and has found, now that the moment has arrived, that none of them are adequate. She waited. She was sitting at June's kitchen table with a cup of real coffee. June had made a fresh pot when she heard the phone ring, because June understood that certain phone calls require certain preparations. And Lily was in the next room doing homework, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of something baking, and the valley was dark outside the window and entirely itself. Dale said, "Nora, the Smokehouse." She said, "Yes," he said. "Dad knew." She said, "He did." There was another silence. She could hear, though through the phone, the specific quality of a large house settling around a man who has just understood something that rearranges the landscape of the past. Dale was not a cruel person. She had never believed he was a cruel person. He was a person who had operated within the assumptions his position as oldest son had handed him. Assumptions about value, about worthiness, about who deserved what and why. And those assumptions had been, as of this week, comprehensively dismantled. He said, "I didn't know." She said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I'm sorry, Nora, for for what it looked like in Pratt's office." She looked at the coffee cup. She thought about the almost coffee in her apartment in Millhaven, and the broken igniter on the stove, and the matches in the drawer. She thought about what it would cost her to be angry, and what it would cost her to let it go. And she measured both costs with the precise economy of a woman who has been measuring costs for a long time. "Dale," she said, "go take care of your farm. I'm going to take care of mine." She hung up. She finished the coffee. From the next room, Lily's voice drifted through the doorway, reciting something from a worksheet, a list of state capitals, delivered with the focused seriousness she brought to all memorization tasks. Nora listened to it for a moment. Then she smiled, which was not a thing she'd had occasion to do very much of in recent months, and the smile felt unfamiliar and correct in the way that things feel when they return to you after a long absence. Brent did not call. She had not expected him to. Sandra, through some mechanism Nora never fully traced, sent a card. It arrived at June's house 5 days after the legal filing, a store-bought card with a generic landscape on the front and inside, in Sandra's precise handwriting, the words, "We are so happy for you and Lily. Warmly, Sandra and Brent." Nora read it twice, appreciated the effort it must have required, and put it in the drawer of the nightstand next to the river stone, which she had brought from Millhaven in her bag, and which had migrated, by this point, from the nightstand to the windowsill, where the morning light hit it and showed the particular depth of color in the stone that you couldn't see in artificial light. She was staying at June's for the foreseeable future. June had said to stay as long as she needed, which Nora understood to mean as long as she wanted, which June further clarified one morning over breakfast by saying, "I have been rattling around in this house alone for 11 years, Nora. You and that child are not a burden. You are the correction of a mistake the universe made when it decided I should live alone." Lily had, within a week of their extended stay, reorganized June's chicken coop according to a system she had devised independently and which increased the average daily egg count by 3, a fact she reported to Nora and June at dinner with the same careful precision she applied to state capitals, and which June received as though it were news of national significance. Nora had enrolled Lily in the Waynesboro Elementary School on a temporary basis. Within 2 days, Lily had located the school library, assessed its collection, and put in a formal request to the librarian for 3 specific titles she wanted added, which the librarian had received with a mixture of surprise and approval that Nora recognized as the correct response. The authentication process took 11 weeks. Edward Bauer coordinated with specialists from 3 different institutions, a numismatist from the Smithsonian's numismatic collection, a metals and bonds expert from a Washington estate firm, and 2 art historians, one from the National Gallery and one from a university in Amsterdam, who had spent 30 years cataloging works from exactly the Dutch and Flemish period that the paintings represented. They came to the Smokehouse in sequence, each bringing their own cases and their own instruments and their own particular quality of professional stillness in the face of what they found in the sealed room. The coin specialist sat on the flagstone floor for 40 minutes with a single coin from the 5th box, a coin that turned out to be one of only 9 known examples of a specific pre-Depression minting error that had been documented in academic literature, but had not appeared at public auction in over a decade. When he stood up, his knees were dusty, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just touched something he had spent years believing he might never encounter. The art historians moved through the rolled canvases in a silence that wasn't the silence of people finding nothing remarkable, but of people finding too much to speak about immediately. The Amsterdam specialist, on the 2nd day, attributed 3 of the paintings to specific artists with a confidence she characterized as very high. 2 of those attributions, when they were announced publicly several weeks later, made news in circles that did not typically concern themselves with the contents of Virginia smokehouses. The final authenticated valuation, delivered by Edward Bauer in a letter that Clara Finch received and called Nora about at 7:45 in the morning was $331 million. The preliminary estimate had been conservative. Edward Bauer's note at the bottom of the letter said, characteristically, "I told you it could change in either direction." I was technically correct. She went back to Millhaven once to collect the rest of her things, which fit in her car in under an hour, exactly as she had always known they would. She returned the key to the landlord, a man she had spoken to perhaps 4 times in 3 years, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who has heard something and is not sure whether to reference it. And she looked at him with the expression of someone who has decided irrevocably that certain conversations are simply not worth having, and they parted without drama and with mutual relief. She paid the electric bill from her Millhaven account, which was the first bill she paid after the initial legal trust funds were established by Clara Finch. She paid it online, at June's kitchen table, on a Tuesday morning while Lily was at school. The payment processed in seconds. She looked at the confirmation number on the screen for a moment. Then she closed the laptop. She made an appointment at a dentist in Waynesboro for the following Thursday. Lily's back tooth was a cavity, the dentist confirmed, medium-sized, entirely fixable. The copay was $62. Nora paid it and drove Lily home with a bag of sugar-free lemon drops the hygienist had given her, and Captain buckled in the back seat with his own seat belt, which was Lily's standard practice and which Nora had never once objected to. She bought the farm, not her father's farm, Dale's farm now, legally and permanently, and she had no interest in dispossessing her brother of something he had worked for 21 years. She bought a farm of her own, 68 acres on the south-facing side of a ridge, approximately 4 miles from the Smokehouse parcel, a property that had been on the market for 3 years because the house needed significant work and the land needed clearing, and most people who looked at it saw the problems more clearly than the possibility. She saw the possibility immediately and completely, the way she had seen it in the north wall of the Smokehouse, and she bought it with a decisiveness that made Clara Finch smile the particular smile of an attorney who has come to trust her client's judgment about things that look broken from the outside and turn out not to be. The house renovation took 7 months. Lily chose her room on the first visit, a corner room on the 2nd floor with windows on 2 walls and a view of the ridge to the east, where the morning light arrived first. And she described, in considerable detail, exactly how she wanted it arranged, a description Nora recorded on her phone and provided to the contractor, who said it was the most precise room specification he had received from an 8-year-old in his professional career. Captain got a shelf. She kept the smokehouse. She had considered, briefly, whether to have it restored or whether to simply incorporate the parcel into the new farm's boundary and let the structure stand as it was. She decided to restore it. Not to its original function. There was no need for a smokehouse in any practical sense, but to its structural integrity. The collapsed tin roof replaced, the vines cleared, the exterior mortar repointed, the interior swept and cleaned down to the flagstone of the hidden room, which she had the facing wall permanently opened and secured, so that the room was always accessible and always visible, because she believed, without being able to entirely articulate why, that keeping things sealed was not something she was interested in doing anymore. She took Lily into the room for the first time in the spring, when the authentication was complete and the restoration was underway, and the light through the open door fell on the flagstone floor in a long, bright rectangle. Lily walked around the perimeter of the room slowly, touching the brick walls, looking at the empty shelving where the oilcloth packages had been, looking at the iron strong boxes which were now open and empty, their contents accounted for and secured. She looked at the combination lock on the facing section, which Nora had left in place. She looked at everything with the careful thoroughness that was her characteristic way of encountering new information. Then she said, "He built this by himself?" "Your great-great-grandfather," Nora said. "Yes." Lily thought about this. "He built it so that the right person would find it." "That's what I think. How did he know you would be the right person?" Nora looked at the room, at the flagstone floor, and the empty shelves, and the cold brick walls that had held their secret through 80 years of weather and time, and the gradual dissolution of the world that had produced them. "I don't think he knew it would be me specifically," she said. "I think he built it for whoever ended up needing it most." Lily considered this with the gravity she brought to ideas she was still working out. Then she said, "That's actually very smart." "It is," Nora said. Outside, through the open door of the smokehouse, the Shenandoah Valley was doing what it does in spring, filling itself back up with color, green coming back into the ridges in a slow wave from south to north, the creek behind the new farm running full with snowmelt, the air carrying that specific combination of creek water and soil and new growth that Nora had spent 30 years in other places reaching for and failing to find. She stood in the doorway of her grandfather's sealed room, the one her brothers had not wanted, the one that had been dismissed in a conference room, while she sat across the table with her hands in her lap and said nothing, and she felt the valley around her with the specific completeness of someone who has returned to a place they should never have left. The morning light moved across the flagstone floor. The shelves stood empty and clean, so the combination lock on the open-facing section caught the light briefly. The iron dial, worn to a dull sheen by the hands of a man she had never met, who had trusted brick and oilcloth and the right numbers in the right sequence and the correct person at the correct time, and had been right about all of it. She had been right too, she thought, to come, to stay, to take the chisel to the mortar and the pry bar to the seam, and to stand in the cold and wait for what she already, somewhere beneath everything, suspected was there. The smokehouse gave it back, all of it. 80 years of patience returned in a single November week to a woman who had earned, without anyone watching, exactly this. She took the key from her coat pocket, the old skeleton key from First Valley Bank, still heavy, still faintly greasy at the bow, and hung it on the nail above the facing section's iron fitting, where her grandfather had presumably kept it, and from which it had presumably been removed, and passed along again until it arrived. Through the slow, certain, unstoppable motion of the right things, moving toward the right people, in the palm of her hand. Then she went back outside into the spring morning, where Lily was sitting in the new grass, with Captain propped beside her, and the valley spread out below the ridge in every direction. And she sat down next to her daughter, and they were quiet together for a while, which was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.